I was like, oh, Microsoft Word. So you'll go here. Why not? It's a lot cheaper, so why not? Yeah. Hello, simple like this one. Like my philosophy professor, she grades like one math. Yeah, I see the tracks. I mean, I'm from too. Eden, like art of Eden landscape. Edgewater. Like do all the trees they have.
Okay, good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
What's up? My name is Professor Bassem Shaban. I teach world religions here at Samoa State College. And we have organized this event dealing with incarceration and many of the other issues that surrounds it. So we have a pretty solid agenda for you with respected and distinguished speakers from the community, from the academic and creative-based community. So we're going to get started with a brief, quick presentation and then get into the other elements of the program. The problem of incarceration has been an issue for our society for many decades. In the past, we have heard about different campaigns to either reduce the population or rehabilitate inmates away from a life of crime. But have these campaigns really helped reduce the levels of incarceration in our communities? How has privatizing many of the prisons around the U.S. affected the issue? What are some of the solutions to the problem? These are some of the questions we will be discussing tonight. It is important in our time of political division, local tensions, and media bias to clear the clutter of misinformation and present the topic in a civil and constructive way. With this intention in mind, we have organized this event at Samoa State College and invited speakers from the faith and academic community to help us understand the issue from their perspective and identify solutions to make our community safer and more responsive with proper tools and accurate information about the issue of incarceration in America. So for this section, I want to invite two of my students who are going to do a general presentation about the issue based on statistics, as well as getting into some global comparison to other countries. Great.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. So we have set up a PowerPoint for you guys to see with just some statistics and also a little funny video. So according to the U.S. Bureau of Justice statistics, 2,220,300 adults were incarcerated in U.S. federal and state prisons. According to a research made by NYU School of Law, the effect on the crime rate of increasing incarceration has been essentially zero. Men in prison have much lower education levels than those outside. Only about 40% have a high school diploma or more, compared to about 80% of those outside of prison. Here's a little video.
It's been years since your prison education fantasy was a reality. Back in 1847, Sing Sing's prison education program had a curriculum that included reading, writing, math, history, geography, physiology, and even phys ed.
Great! Sign me up. That was a long time ago. Government budget cuts have systematically eliminated any opportunity for people to educate themselves while in prison.
In 1994, tough on crime was all the rage, and American politicians hated the idea that prisoners should get anything.
Bad guys getting Pell Grants? No, they should be getting Hell Ants or something. I hate that.
Since then, we've gone from having 350 college degree programs for prisoners across the country to just 12. And good luck getting into the programs that do exist. The largest prison training program in the country has a waiting list of 10,000 people.
Excuse me, how long have you been waiting here?
And this is a real shame because studies show that education is the easiest, cheapest way to reduce recidivism. Right now, 40% of federal prisoners are back behind bars within just 3 years.
And instead of trying to reduce that number, this system does everything in its power to make sure that we end up back in here again.
Hope you enjoyed that. The study shows that education is the easiest and the cheapest way to reduce recidivism.
All right, thank you, Karina. So we're gonna ask our speakers to come up to the table as I read their bios. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Cynthia Schmidt. She's Director of the Center for Law and Policy at the University of Central Florida. She's a lecturer in the Department of Legal Studies as well as an attorney. She has practiced criminal defense in the Central Florida area for the last 14 years, prior to becoming an educator in the last 13 years. She is a past president of the Central Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and the recipient of the Orange County Bar's Liberty Bell Award 2012 for exemplary service to the community. She served the people of Sanford, Florida, and the facilitator of the Police Community Relations Blue Ribbon Panel as a result of the death of Mr. Trayvon Martin. She is the past president of the Orange County Bar Association Foundation and serves on Sheriff Deming's Violent Crime Task Force. Dr. Schmidt has served on numerous panels about race, police practices, and social justice. She is the mother of a 21-year-old student, Alexandra, who is currently studying in Cuba. Dr. Schmidt is honored to be part of many cross-cultural conversation, both through work and in her personal life, and looks forward to hearing other points of view through this panel. Our second speaker, once Dr. Schmidt is done with her presentation, is Pastor Jim Coffin. He is Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida, brings to his current role a diverse life experience. Mr. Coffin grew up on a farm in Missouri. After graduating from high school, he spent a year as a church volunteer in Mexico. He has earned a degree in theology at or from Newbold College in England, and was later ordained as a minister of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. During his career, he worked in both the United States for 26 years and Australia for 10 years. In addition to residing overseas for extended periods, he has traveled extensively in Europe, Asia, and the South Pacific. Pastor Coffin spent 9 years of his pastoral work in youth ministry and 9 years as an editor of the Adventist Church publication. His last 18 years before assuming his current role, he served as senior pastor of Markham Woods Church of the Seventh-day Adventist in Longwood, Florida. He has authored 3 books dealing with the theory about, practice of, and questions arising from religion. He has written scores of articles for religious publications and websites, and he has had some 50 My Word opinion pieces printed in the Orlando Sentinel, usually addressing religious and social ethical issues. He and his Australian wife have been married for 36 years and have 3 grown sons. Our last speaker will be Imam Muhammad Musri, who is President and Senior Imam of the Islamic Society of Central Florida, which includes 10 mosques, a full-time accredited school, a child care center, a social services organization, and an interfaith outreach department which provides hospital and prison chaplains and partners with various faith communities to promote peace and respect among all people. He served for 4 years as the co-chair of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. He also has a interfaith radio show at WMFE, the PBS or NPR affiliate here in Orlando, called The 3 Wise Guys. So he's one of the wise guys. Imam Musri also has a TV program on Islam and is regularly interviewed by local, national, and international TV, radio, and print media. Imam Musri is a regular lecturer on Islam, Islamic law, and the culture of the Middle East at various colleges and universities. And he was finally appointed by Governor Jeb Bush, former Governor Jeb Bush, as a member of the Florida Governor's Faith-Based Advisory Council. So with that, help me welcome all of our speakers. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to present their points of view and perspectives. And once all of them have spoken, we will open it to questions from the audience. So make sure to keep your questions to the very end. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move around a little bit, although I know we're recording, so I won't go crazy. But I do want to be able to move so I can at least see the PowerPoint. Greetings to Seminole State. I bring you greetings from the University of Central Florida. I'm so glad to be here. I met some of you back, I think it was January or so. And some of you I spoke to maybe a few weeks ago over at RMC. And in order to gauge how many of you have heard my presentation before, by show of hands, if you've heard me speak, can you please raise your hand? All right, so I think what I'll do, with the professor's permission, is blow through mass incarceration and then pick up a little bit on the death penalty, which is on the same thumb drive. And I apologize to our IT specialist. I also apologize to the imam and the pastor for my back. Okay, so let's go through mass incarceration pretty quickly. Next slide. Back up one. In between there should be a slide about the school to prison pipeline. Maybe not. All right, we'll start with this. As you can see, the population of the people incarcerated has jumped substantially beginning in the 1980s. I know that many of you are young, and so you may not have been on this planet for 50 years like myself, so maybe you don't know how much our population has changed or not over the years. But trust me, it has not shifted proportionate to the chart. We did have a baby boom after World War II ended, but this is a huge jump in the incarceration rate from the 1980s until modern day. You can see for comparison, the little line at the bottom is the juvenile rate. For those of you, I hope you can see, we've got juveniles staying at a pretty steady rate over the years, but the people in jail, meaning misdemeanors, have jumped substantially, and even more so the people in prison, meaning people inside for felonies. Next slide. So I wanted to speak with you about the school to prison pipeline, and then turn it on its head and talk about a prison to school pipeline, and hopefully save myself enough time to talk about the death penalty. We've got this concept that, and in fact it's been proven, that those who've been suspended have a much greater likelihood of eventually ending up in prison. Thank you, so our panelists can see, that's wonderful, thanks very much. So the people who are suspended have twice the likelihood of not graduating. I was suspended, I'll admit that. So it doesn't mean that everyone who's suspended can't graduate, but there's twice the likelihood of not graduating if you're suspended. And if you're suspended, as we know, in the modern economy, it's difficult to get a job paying very well if you don't have the paper, agreed? And so if you don't have the ability to get a good paying job, the likelihood is great you're going to live a life of poverty, and inside of the cycle of poverty, or the deep pockets of poverty, it's easier to find yourself in a situation where criminal activity may happen, and that you get caught up in the life, and off you may go to prison. Here's the rub. Watch the bottom bold. Black males are 4 times as likely to be suspended as white male students. And I would assert that it is not because they are 4 times more difficult to teach. I would assert that it's because we have the institutional racism, and we have teachers who are not prone to watch for the differences in how they're treating the different races, or sometimes the different genders. Next slide, please. So we've got, in the United States, our population regarding the balance of the world is just 5%. But we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Next slide. And here's where it gets really painful. White men have the likelihood in their lifetime at the rate of 1 in 17 of being in the system. But black men, 1 in 3. Next slide. So let's talk about where this comes from. The 13th Amendment says that slavery is ended, this is right after the Civil War, except for circumstances related to crime. Next slide. And so after we ended the Civil War, we still had deep agriculture in the South, we still had cotton, we still had tobacco, and so there was a convict lease system. And so our economy in the South needed people to pick the cotton, and so convicts were leased out. And so there was this mindset that blacks were more likely to be thieves, and blacks were lazy. And so they were picked up on silly charges that the white folks weren't picked up on, like loitering, or trespass, or theft of a chicken. And they'd be carried off to prison and then leased out for agriculture. On top of that, fast forward many, many years, we've got Nixon starting a war on drugs when we didn't even have crack yet. He was talking about war on drugs regarding marijuana. We also had Reagan with tough on crime stance. Next slide. But it really started under Bill Clinton. I'm sorry I'm going so fast, but I'm short on time. Bear with me. It'll all make sense, I think. Just get a feeling of it. Bill Clinton had the anti-crime bill that put $30 billion into policing. And we also ended up with a parameter where crack carried 100 times more months in prison than did powder. And if you think about the stereotypes of who used crack and who used powder, this is the outcomes. It was huge disparities. And Bill Clinton spoke specifically to that, saying he does not want to equalize the penalties. Next slide. Minimum mandatories started to come into play. The judge could not exercise discretion to give anything less than the number of months or years called for by statute. And 3 strikes and you're out. Next slide. So the federal crime bill of 1994, I said $30 billion to policing, which means more people are getting swept up in the net. More prisons are being built. What good is a prison if you don't have humans in cages? And we've got the private prison industry, which we heard about from your professor. And so there was incentives for people to make money off of other humans in cages. And so that created a lobbying structure called ALEC, which if you've seen the movie, the documentary 13th, you heard all about that. And so the legislators were lobbied to create yet more prisons, which meant then more arrests, and we had then our very first chart that we saw a few minutes ago. So we've got 13th being highlighted on this slide. I want to make sure, that's okay, you're good. I really want to make sure you guys have an opportunity to think about the book, The New Jim Crow, by Michelle Alexander. If you haven't read it, I know it's hard to read. First of all, it's very long, and furthermore, it'll break your heart. But you really should try to delve into it, at least in part, because it is extraordinary and explains this mass incarceration, meaning the new Jim Crow, as opposed to the Jim Crow that came out of the Civil War. So next slide. We've got the cycle of poverty that happens. When people come out of prison, it is very difficult to get employed. It's very difficult to find affordable housing. You can't get benefits. Some business licenses you cannot have. It creates a cycle of poverty. And here's where it's really horrible. Because you will not only have this person who paid their dues, who did what they needed to do and did time and came out and wants to start over, I would assert, and they can't because you have to check the box, depending on the municipality. But also then what happens to their family? It creates a cycle of poverty for the whole family, potentially. Next slide. So, I know one of your fellow students, ma'am, your name?
Nancy.
Nancy. Nancy heard me speak before about Angela Davis and bought 3 of her books. And so there's some dialogue inside some scholarship about what can we do as an alternative to prisons. And so there are thoughts about civil citations so that people don't get arrested. There's discussion about restorative justice, and certainly diversion courts, drug court, mental health court. So there are things that we can think about as a society if we are not trying to make money off of people being in cages. Next slide. So that was the fastest I've ever talked about the school to prison pipeline. Let's turn it on its head. Let's talk about a prison to school pipeline. And your also very cool video that you saw earlier speaks to this. It's like a perfect setup. So let's do it. Next slide. So, Pell Grants established in 1972, but under Bill Clinton, Congress in 1994 said, we don't want Pell Grants to go to the prisoners. We don't want to make prison something good. We don't want to give people on the inside something that folks on the outside might not have the ability to avail themselves of because they're grinding at you're driving a forklift or whatever. So if the guys on the outside don't have time to go use the Pell Grant, guys on the inside shouldn't either. So we got rid of Pell Grants for prisoners in 1994. Very short-sighted, because what are these guys going to study on the inside if they can't study literature? I think they're going to study how to be a better criminal, perhaps. Maybe get a PhD in international crime, arguably. So, but here, this is where your video was created in 2015. I saw a number on there. In 2016, Obama, through his Secretary of Education, created a second chance Pell Grant for purposes of study. So that 67, next slide, 67 universities were allowed to take Pell Grants into the corrections department. And so inmates in different colleges were able to go and study on the inside. Professors, next slide, from Cornell, Ohio State, and the University of Maryland went to Jessup Correctional at the top. Can you imagine? Cornell is showing up at the university. They have people on sabbatical going over and teaching the prisoners. And this was for purposes of study. Next slide. Because the Rand Corporation studied this and learned that every dollar invested in higher ed inside the prisons resulted in $5 of savings. Because the folks who did avail themselves of this education were 43% less likely to reoffend. When they go in, who's paying for it? We are. It's $60 a day at the Orange County Jail for everybody who's in there, right? Much less prisons, more. And then that's not even get started about death row, how much that costs. So if we can keep people from reoffending, then they're also going to be paying for their kids' food, arguably, instead of drawing down benefits, right? And paying taxes and whatnot. So you can see how it really would feed off of itself. And they're 13% more likely to be employed upon release. Next slide. Well, of course, Congress is going to try to intercede. So we have members of Congress who are all about it and trying to advance it, and other members of Congress who are trying to shut it down. Last I checked, which was I think about a month ago, both of these have not moved anywhere. So it's still in play. But I challenge you to think about under the new administration, because that was Obama. Now we have Trump. And I told you it was a Secretary of Education. Secretary of Education, anybody heard about this Betsy DeVos?
Yeah.
So,
She doesn't
now
know
she
anything.
doesn't know about this. Like, let's be real. She doesn't know about it yet, probably, right? I don't think she was, like, deeply involved in education all these many years. I know I'm on video, that's okay. Cindy Schmidt, UCF, it's all right. Call my boss. But I think that the odds are decent that this could be vulnerable. It could be vulnerable, although it should make fiscal sense to the Republicans. Fiscally conservative, pays for itself. I'm getting worked up. Next slide. So, what can we do with it locally? It's all well and good to talk about ideas that are esoteric on a national scale. Locally, what can we do? I'm at UCF. We have an online degree program. We thought we were making it for sailors and submarines. Why don't we make it for the prisoners inside the Department of Corrections? Problem. You have to have an AA to get into our program. But we know people at state colleges. Hi, Professor. So, could we partner with Seminole State? Could we partner with Valencia? We're in dialogues. I have a big meeting on it this week. I'm so glad I'm thinking about this. Okay, so it's possible we can take this and run with it. We're going to encounter barriers because it may be difficult to get all of the necessary technology inside of the prisons, right? Some of those guys should not be getting on the internet, child porn charges, you know what I mean? They shouldn't be contacting their victims, but this is why we have things called firewalls, don't we? I mean, I think we could do this. So I'm very excited about the concept. How do we fund it? It's probably too late to become a second chance Pell Grant university because that did roll out in 2016. But Orlando has some money. Seminole County has some money. How about some private donors? There are people that know some people in this town, right? And I think if we could say that, you know what, most of these people are not going to do life. Most of them are going to get out at some point, be our neighbors. Wouldn't we like to be neighbors who could get a job? pay their taxes, and raise their family. And on that, I see I'm like 2 minutes over. I apologize to the professor. Thanks very much.
Very often if I give presentations of this nature, I talk about life experience, and this is one where I can't say from life experience what incarceration is all about. However, as a pastor, I did have people who were not members of my church who I had reason to interact with, who were involved in the justice system, and if we could call it justice. And also then I did have members of my congregation who needed to be visited. And here in the United States, we have just a very ugly underbelly of the way we deal with crime, and the average person doesn't really know much about it at all. You know, maybe if you watch MSNBC on the weekend, you know, or you know, you see some of these so-called documentaries, but for the most part, we really don't know much about it. One afternoon I got a phone call from a parishioner who had been picked up for embezzlement. So this wasn't, he wasn't going to be treated as badly as many would be because it's a white-collar crime. But he needed to be bailed out, and so he turned to me and bailed him out. So I went down to the Orange County Detention Center and went in to take care of all the details of bailing him out. And it was a slow day for crime in Orange County, and it just so happened that it was a bounty hunter who was looking after the bondsman's office that day. And he was just getting ready to take a trip west. And I just tell you this to give you kind of an idea of how totally ugly this whole exercise is. And so I began to ask him questions. I'd never met a bounty hunter before. And actually, I take that back. I did meet a bounty hunter on the plane once. And he told me that he had his own version of the Miranda. He told me a little bit about, you know, people that he had picked up and so on. He said, my reading of the Miranda to them is this: you're allowed to make 2 phone calls, one to a doctor and one to a priest. And if you don't cooperate with me completely, you're going to need both. So anyway, but I talked to this bounty hunter, and he was telling me he was just getting ready to go out to Arizona to pick up 3 people who had jumped bail. And he explained to me, when you jump bail, you have no rights anymore. You know, Miranda doesn't, you know, there's nothing. Basically, you're a commodity. There's been a price put on you. The bonding company stands to lose or to gain on the basis of whether they have your body or whether they don't. And so that's what happens. And so he said, my old Pontiac out there, or whatever it was, he said, I have in the back, I have a big eye bolt welded to the floor, and there's a big steel plate under it. And so he said, I go get somebody. He said, I usually wait, if I have to go cross country, I wait until I've gotten, you know, sort of intelligence reports that there are 3 or 4 of them there together, and then up to 3. Actually, 3 was what he would haul in his car. He had a screen between himself and the prisoners that he would pick up. And he said, I actually just use a log chain with a padlock around their necks. And I put the other end to the eye bolt, and I lock them with that. And so I asked a few questions, you know, like, well, what do you do with the first prisoner when you're going after the second one? Well, he said, you know, if I could find a shade tree to park the car under, I put him in the shade. Otherwise, you know, he just sits in the car, and that's it. And I said, have you ever had anybody escape? He said, no. But he said, I have had one person who tried so hard to escape that he tore all of his toenails off in just trying to pry his way loose. And so I said to him, well, you know, then you get all 3 of them in there, you know, and you start coming back and it's just you. I said, you know, excuse my indiscretion here, but what about toilet stops? You know, do you take them one at a time into a truck stop or what? Cornfields. He said, we pull over. He said, I get out my double-barrel shotgun, you know, and he said, you know, the person goes in the cornfield with the shotgun trained on him the whole time. And he said, for some people, that's very beneficial to the process. Other people, it kind of slows the process up. Anyway, it just really boggled my mind, you know, because I don't live in that world. You know, I mean, I have visited a number of people in prison and so on, but I don't live in that world, and the average person doesn't live in that world, and we really don't have much to do with it, and therefore, it doesn't really exist for most of us. It's as if it doesn't count. Well, you know, if we stop and think about it, the idea, and this was alluded to in the earlier presentation, the idea that we have private corporations that are running prisons, and the way they make money is by ensuring that their facility is full. Now, what kind of a disincentive is that to keep people out of prison? So right there, we have a huge problem. We have a great conflict of interest that we seem to be willing to live with. And in fact, it's on the increase. More and more prisons are privatizing as opposed to going the other direction. And we would, you know, normally think, well, if we could get rid of prisons altogether, that would be wonderful. Well, not if you've got a big corporation out there that's running a business that is dependent on having prisoners. The judges and the prosecutors aren't considered to be successful on the basis of how many people they have kept out of prison, or how many alternative arrangements they have created, or how much they have reduced recidivism. You know, they become famous on the basis of how many people, how many victories they win, you know, how many people they get convictions on, and how many people they send to prison. And also the politicians find that, you know, and Nixon was one of the very first law and order politicians in our modern era. You know, back in the Wild West, they did that a bit. But Nixon, you know, came on with a law and order agenda. Well, that means that what we're going to do is we're going to designate certain people as our scapegoats. And we're going to, you know, hang the problems of society on them, and then hang them or put them in prison. Hang them figuratively, not literally. In the old days, we called the prison a penitentiary. In other words, the idea was that there was a penitence that was learned. You know, now it probably wasn't well thought through then, but at least the idea was you went, and with the passage of time and so on, you were going to come out better for having gone. And nowadays, you know, as was mentioned again earlier, instead of taking time to educate people, you know, we say, well, that's too costly. And we're happy to live with the recidivism, it seems. And we have really very limited concept that this is going to be therapeutic in any way. This is simply putting a problem as we perceive it, putting a problem behind bars so that we don't have to think about it, we don't have to worry about it, you know, until later. Now, we have a society that has a lot of complex issues. And, you know, there's no question but what there are these concentric circles and so on that are all very complex and that all are kind of like downward spirals all working together. And, you know, and these are very, very difficult to change because we get into life cycle patterns. The poor have their particular life cycles that they get into, their patterns that they get into. The rich have theirs that they get into. And they may not overlap, seemingly, and yet they do intersect more than we might think. And so if we look at the home life of many of children, you know, it is certainly less than ideal. But that's contributed to by, you know, a lot of other social factors that come into play. We have drugs, we have guns, we have racial disparity. All of these things play into this maze that comes out and keeps feeding the prisons. So there are more and more. And then we have a problem of boredom. There's what we call the law of unforeseen consequences. You know, we looked at